Okay, so I would like to introduce Jennifer Bloom, who's right there at the top of your screen on the other side of me, opposite Sue there. Jennifer, are you off mute now, girl? Okay, so
No, I'm here. I'm off mute now.
okay, good, making sure. So Jennifer and I have known each other. I'm excited about this. So Jennifer and I have known each other for over 17 years. Jennifer lives in Austin. She's a poet, a singer, a scholar. She has just released her second volume of poetry called Within My Illusions, and it's wonderful. And if you have not ever checked out her website, it's Jennifer-Bloom, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. Like it's just so beautiful, and she has so many different offerings. And if you need a little bit of opportunity to sort of chill in these chaotic times, she is your go-to woman, I promise. Um, and so what we're going to do is we're going to have Jen conduct a sort of informal interview. And what happened was that, like, back in June, Jen and I were sitting in my front yard, 6 feet apart, and we were talking about the fact that my book was coming out and we weren't going to have a book launch party. And Jen had said years ago she would have a book launch party at her beautiful tree house in North Austin. And I was feeling kind of sad and bummed. And what was I going to do? I, couldn't imagine. And Jen was like, no, no, we'll take care of it. We'll have a Zoom party. I'll interview you. And I thought, well, that could be kind of fun. And a couple of weeks ago, I was sitting on her deck, having dinner. And we were talking about tonight and what we might want to do. And I said, well, you should probably ask me some questions. And yeah, she we started sort of talking with one question, and then when we got to the end of that question, Jennifer naturally sort of just started to ask her own second question, and then we both sort of stopped and we were like, no, 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 wait, we can't, we don't want to plan anything. This all has to be raw and in the moment. So, but now it's like the actual night, and I'm sort of worried about what she's going to say, but I'm also trusting that everything's going to be good, because you're kind of like voyeurs here in this moment, because Jennifer and I go out, well, now it's sort of in on her deck or in my yard, but we pre-pandemic used to go out all the time, and we would have what we called these sparkly evenings with these really amazing conversations, and Jen would drink tea and I would drink something bubbly, and that's what you're going to get a peek out at tonight. And now I better shut up because I'll just keep going so you don't have to ask me questions I'm embarrassed to answer.
Well, first of all, congratulations.
Hi, Jen.
Hi, can you hear me? Can everyone hear me? Congratulations. I think Jennifer, okay, there you go. So,
thank you.
And yeah, everyone, I see Rachel and Jimmy giving a round of applause, because this is like a major milestone and accomplishment. And so the first thing that I really want to honor and acknowledge this piece of work that's in the world now in solid form, and it's a really wonderful moment, and I really want for you to like take in the whole moment of this, because it's really special, and you are in my treehouse. This is welcome everyone to my magical treehouse. I like to say I live in a magical treehouse at the edge of an enchanted forest, and I'm drinking bubbly, sparkling water in your honor tonight. And so, cheers, everyone. If you have a beverage, cheers to Jennifer and to Smoking Glass and to Joel and James. I met Jennifer almost 17 years ago when I moved to Austin. I met her on my second day in Austin. She's the first person I met when I moved to Austin. And when I found out that she was we met through our children, our sons, who were 1 year old at the time. And when I found out that she was a writer, I kind of was like, oh, I want to be friends with you. and I've never told you that, but it was like, Jennifer, she was working on Crossing at the time. And so very shortly after I met Jennifer, I met Joel and James. And so I've known them almost as long as I've known you. And I had I've actually had tremendous honor of reading all three of these books: Crossing, I Too Have Suffered in the Garden, and now Smoking Glass, in multiple iterations as she was working on them. I've gotten to be a beta reader for the books. We've had long conversations about these characters, the writing, and so I feel like I'm intimately part of this world with you and with Joel and James and Adam, and so in thinking about this conversation tonight. It's and for those of you who've been reading Jennifer's book, and whether you've gotten to this book Smoke and Glass or not yet, because of course you all will, it is there's this beautiful unfolding in your writing and over the years and in the books. My sense of them, of the writing of the books, of the character of the story, and what I really appreciate about them is that the story is so juicy. Like you craft these like really juicy stories while at the same time writing in such a beautiful, poetic, and when I was listening to you read Joel, it's this really sensual language, and by sensual, really like evoking all of the senses and bringing me as a reader into like this depth of emotion and the depth of the experience of these characters and all of the emotions. And sometimes I find myself so angry, I'm like, I have to put the book down, but I have to see what happens. And so I guess my first question for you, because I mean, you've lived with these characters for a long time, is what is the experience of writing this? Because I mean, my experience reading it is so profoundly emotional. And so what is the experience of writing for you?
Such a great question. I said during an interview on a podcast a couple of days ago, I said, I just want to immerse myself so much in this world that it's just the main thing that I have in my life, which is cool on some levels, but also a little scary. But I think that actually, that's what I mean, is that for me, it is so immersive. I remember when I was just starting to write in Joel's voice, and I was out of college, and I had my one full-time employment stint, which lasted just longer than 6 months. And I was sitting in this training session, and the guy next to me, he finally kind of leaned over and he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Your eyes keep going back and forth and back and forth. Are you okay?" And I was having a conversation in my head. I mean, I was following Joel talking to someone. And so in my mind, I was following that conversation. These men are what I think about. What? Sorry, I'm distracted the way I am in my workshops when someone's in the chat. I love that though. So Rachel, my brother's girlfriend, has just said, "Was that at USAA?" Indeed it was. My 6 months in their employ. Yeah, I mean, I think about these men all the time, and but it's also kind of curious because I like to say that I'm really interested in memories. A lot of y'all have heard me say this, like memory, psychological trauma, betrayal, heartbreak, the lies, the love, the damage, the tenderness, all of that. And yet at the same time, I feel like that is in such sparkly contrast, like that's in contrast to my sparkly life, because I'm able to sort of compartmentalize that, or maybe those emotions, or maybe they somehow add to the sparkliness I feel just generally. I know that sometimes I can get, some people can be like, "Oh my God, Jen, like tone it down." And I don't know if I'm answering your question. I feel like I'm sort of like, I guess the experience of writing for me has been as emotional as the books convey. And yet, at the same time, even if I'm writing a scene that's just harrowing or is so disturbing, or I have tears in my eyes when I finish writing it, at the same time, I'm able to glean the beauty of the process of the writing itself to an extent that it just satiates me thoroughly. And then that sort of adds to my sparkliness. Yeah.
Is there a scene or a moment in this book, and maybe there are many, that surprised you or sort of took your breath away as it emerged, as you were writing it?
Yeah, my God, absolutely. Both with Joel and with James, and for completely different reasons. So, um, I was tutoring this boy in creative writing a few years ago. He wrote nothing that he was a good writer, but didn't write a genre that I'm particularly attracted to. A lot of like horror and that sort of thing. But he had a demon in his story, and for some reason, the demon really kind of spoke to me. And so I started writing these demon scenes in Smoke and Glass, told from Joel's perspective. And if you had told me there would be a demon that in my book, I would have said, no, you're crazy. And of course, I mean, obviously the idea is that it's as Joel says, is this, really happening, or is this sort of like a figment of my overwrought mind? And of course, you get to choose what you think there. But I think even more is James. So James was so surprising to me to write, because he's not the person I thought he was. I spent so many years working on first. I actually wrote The Crossing first, and then I wrote I Too Have Suffered in the Garden, which is Adam's story. And then I went back and revised The Crossing and published that. And in both of those books, but particularly The Crossing, we're seeing James through Joel's lens, through his perspective. And so even though James makes mistakes and Joel's quick to point them out, he also makes a lot of allowances for James, and he really highlights his sensitivity. And James is like this nice guy. I remember, Hopton, at one point when you had me on KAZI book review, you were like, but James is such a nice guy. And I'm like, yeah, but not in this novel. It's not that he's not a nice guy. It's just he's human. And this is part of the reason why I love writing from these different characters' perspectives in the same world, because just because Joel thinks James is awesome doesn't mean that James is so awesome. You get to read him in your own voice and decide. And so there were a couple of scenes in particular. And for those of you who have read Smoke and Glass, the Christmas night scene in 2005 on the phone, that was a hard scene for me to write. I could feel it building, like it was sort of tickling in the back of my mind, and I kept shoving it away, like, no, I'm not going to write that scene. There's that, sometimes I just think of different parts of this world, and like a scene will come to me. It doesn't ever make its way into the book, or I'll even write it, but it doesn't, it's just a fun scene to write. But I remember I was actually drinking this. I remember exactly where I was. It was October. It was 2015. 2014. I was sitting outside Steeping Room drinking one of these, and I put my fingers on that keyboard, and I had to close my eyes because I did not want to see the words on the page. That's how disturbed I was by James's behavior.
I just got chills when you said that.
Did you really?
Yeah.
Really cool.
And I think when what you the perspective and what you talk about the perspective, and I think that especially in Smoke and Glass, because you have the dual perspective, but also having read all three of your books, and because that's like real human existence, is we exist in like this multifaceted, multi-dimensional way, and you capture that so elegantly, so that it's like you want to think someone's an asshole, but then you also know this whole other side, and then you want but then you think they're great, but then they do something, but that's how humans exist. There is no like good and bad, right and wrong. Like we're like the paradox, and you capture that so elegantly. And I know you mentioned this book being in the dual perspective, and I know you want to read something from James. I know James was going to say something, and then I also would love to invite as people, if you have any questions that you want to ask, you can add them to the chat. And I think there's going to be time later if people want to come off mute and ask a question. But if there's a question that you would like for me to ask Jennifer, feel free to type it in the chat. And is this a good moment for you to bring James into the conversation?
Sure. Sure. I'd like to add one thing though, because it kind of came up for me a little bit when you were talking about, this is kind of who we are. We're multifaceted. We have like both that good and that bad in us. But I think that that's part of the reason why I write these scenes as interior monologues, really. It's why I don't use quotation marks. It's why I have commas in the wrong places. Or like in the case, which was like a whole thing as I was editing this last time around, because Joel sometimes leaves them out and sometimes he puts them in. And James, if you've read the book, you've probably noticed that his sections have almost no punctuation other than periods, very very little punctuation, because in my mind, like what I'm feeling as I'm writing these characters is that I am completely in their heads, utterly. And if I'm Joel and I'm hearing James speaking, it's difficult for me. I'm not seeing each phrase come to me as like, oh, now James, it's all jumbled up in my head. And I'm sort of processing it as Joel. He's processing at the same time he's thinking his own thoughts, and he's hearing like, and so yeah, it can kind of be messy in a way, just like these sort of perspectives can be messy. And to me, that feels real. To me, that feels real.
Mhm.